Please pray with me before I offer a message this morning. Gracious, loving God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. During this season of Easter, we are going to do something a little different. We will explore the lectionary readings from the book of Acts, and we'll follow this series for 5 weeks, which all explore this theme of healing. We see that in the very beginning of the church, Christ's Spirit is alive and well and powerful in the midst of the disciples, healing us, healing Jesus' followers in many different ways, both inside and out, healing them from guilt and shame, healing them from divisions among them and prejudice in their society. We will see how Christ heals us during this Easter season. Also that we might find the strength at Pentecost to be renewed on that birthday of the church, to go out healthy and strong and whole to serve this world to which God sends us. Today we'll begin with healing from guilt. Saul, also known as Paul, whom we sometimes call St. Paul, Saul was one of the foremost persecutors of Christians. He oversaw the execution of St. Stephen, the first Christian martyr. Saul enjoyed this work. He found satisfaction in persecuting these Christians whom he considered to be members of some strange sect. So he goes in the beginning of this story and he asks the leaders in the Temple of Jerusalem for permission to go to Damascus. I learned this last week from one of our Lebanese members that Damascus is the oldest city in the world today. Damascus is, of course, the capital of modern-day Syria. It was a troubled place then, it's a troubled place today, and we remember how St. Paul, or Saul, wanted permission from the leaders of the temple and those first Christians who had converted from Judaism. He wanted their permission. Permission from the Jews to go and persecute the Christians in Damascus to see if there was anyone there following the way of Jesus. And he wanted to bring them bound back to Jerusalem for trial and perhaps their own execution. The story begins with these haunting words. It's one of the most well-known beginnings of a biblical story. Meanwhile, Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest, and he asked for this letter that he could bring to Damascus to root out those Christians who were there. Unfortunately, we're reminded that this kind of persecution remains. Being that Christianity is the largest religion in the world, it's also the most persecuted religion in the world. Islam is not far behind it. I heard this report just a couple of days ago on National Public Radio, and the Pew Research Center keeps track of which religions are the most persecuted. Sadly, Christians around the world are first in this statistic, and then Muslims are not far behind. Religious persecution still remains a great sin in our world today. Saul is part of that guilt, part of that persecution. He's one of the ones who is executing what he calls justice. But then when he's on the road to Damascus, he has this remarkable experience. It's depicted in this painting, which is called Paul on the Road to Damascus. In this painting, a French painter named Mickey de Goudebaume, a French artist, she paints this image of Paul that's rather haunting. The image of Christ appears almost as part of an amazing tree that Paul encounters on the road, or Saul, as he's also called. And Saul is knocked to his knees, and he's humbled and, as we know, blinded by the light of God that day. In this painting, we see what an overwhelming experience this was. Some of us have come to Christ in this kind of a way, a lightning bolt, a born-again experience. Others of us have a more gradual journey into faith. Either way, we come to Christ. But we may have members of our family and people who have been so lost that the grace of Christ struck them like thunder and overwhelmed them, and in an instant called them by name. This was the experience that Saul had that day. Jesus says to him as he travels along the road, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" Saul asked, "Who are you, Lord?" And the reply came, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But get up and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do." Saul is reminded that every time he persecutes one of Jesus' followers, he's persecuting Jesus himself. And Jesus comes in person to tell him this. I have to correct my sermon from last week. I was talking about the resurrected Christ only appearing to those whom he had met during his pre-crucifixion life. And this is the one exception to that rule. He appears to Saul on the road. And this is a very real experience that Paul actually writes about, Saul or Paul writes about in different places in the Bible. It's corroborated by his writings in 1 Corinthians and in other places in the book of Acts. This was clearly a very real experience that he had of the risen Christ. He was the one person who did not know Jesus during Jesus' lifetime, who does nevertheless experience him in the resurrected form. And Jesus, through the hands of Ananias, this faithful disciple, prays for this sinful persecutor of Christians. Ananias does the bold act of meeting this Christian hunter, and he prays for him. He lays hands on him, and scales fall from Saul's eyes. And he can suddenly see the way that he must go. This must have taken great courage for Ananias to do this. We're invited this morning to meditate on those wars that are within us. Whatever guilt, whatever shame, whatever burden that we might carry that is like the burden that Saul carried that day. The internal conflicts. Those words that Paul was breathing out, murder and threats against the disciples of the Lord. He was breathing it. He had that hate in his very breath. Sometimes anger and condemnation is in our own breath, whether it's for others or for ourselves, in the words that we utter or the discouraging words that we'll say to our own spirits. What is that guilt? What is that burden that we carry? And what we do to be healed? This is the question of our scriptures today. Jesus knew that Saul was lost, that there was an internal war in his heart that must be resolved and put to peace. Sometimes we need someone else to be the presence of Christ and to help us to make peace within ourselves, as Jesus did for Saul that day. I remember when I was teaching junior high Spanish, I was a miserable man at that time. I was in a very difficult assignment with very challenging students. And it wasn't the right time for me to be a teacher. I had some gifts and graces for that work, but I was in it for the wrong reasons, mostly to make a paycheck during some lean times in my life. I didn't feel called to be there. And if you're not called to be a junior high teacher, get out now. I speak from experience. And those who are called, bless your hearts. Thank you so much for being patient with all of us when we were junior high students ourselves. During this time, thankfully, I was attending worship. On Sundays, I would go to this small church that I attended throughout college and then afterwards. And our campus minister, who remained my personal pastor, her name was Reverend Odette. Odette saw that I was miserable, though I didn't see it myself. And she said, "James, would you be willing to come visit with me at my house over tea?" And I said, "Sure, why?" And she says, "You look wiped out." I doubted that was true, but nevertheless, I accepted the invitation. She began that day that I went to her house to ask me some questions about how it was with my soul, whether I was in touch with a support system, my family, or friends. She asked me, did I have any siblings? And I said, well, yes, I had a younger brother named Jeff. And she said, how long has it been since you've spoken to your brother? And when she asked that question, a key turned and the floodgates opened and I sobbed and I cried. Somehow she found this inroad to my spirit. I was so depressed and lonely for not having talked to my brother in so long or with my parents. I had not been tapping into the strength that I so dearly needed. I didn't even know I loved my brother that much. But there I was crying and sobbing, and her little dog, Odette's dog, walked up to me and got up on its hind legs and put its two front paws on my knee and stared into my eyes in order to comfort me. Even the dog knew I needed support that day. And we talked about the burdens that I was carrying, these voices in my head. I should finish out that year. I must complete the commitment that I made to the principal. And she said, where does that should come from? Is it God's or is it your own? I realized this was more of an internal conflict that I was having. She looked at me and sincerely and said, you can quit, you know. And the thought had never crossed my mind. She said, but don't decide now. She taught me this method to pray every day because this is a bigger question. Pray every day for weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, and see if you gain clarity on this subject. And I did. And I felt more and more convicted that I was in the wrong job at the wrong time. And I turned in my resignation. And I was free. I listened to the Eagles driving out of that parking lot. I'm already gone. And I was liberated to get back to what I was truly called to do. But it took someone who was willing to intervene, who would preach a message of grace to me and encourage me to show grace to myself. An inner healing was necessary. We're invited this morning to prayerfully discern how would the risen Christ heal and put to rest our inner conflicts, our guilt, our shame, our empty obligations, which weigh too heavily upon us. Invite us to think about this healing and administer this healing to ourselves so that we no longer breathe threats or murderous thoughts, even to our own spirits, but rather we are liberated by the grace and forgiveness of God, just as those scales fell from the eyes of Saul. Sometimes we need someone to intervene. Sometimes we may need to intervene in someone else's life, be those hands of Ananias who would lay his hands on someone and pray for them, even despite his fear of Paul. Perhaps we need to intervene and speak that word of grace that someone else around us so urgently needs. This last week, Sherry stopped by the office and said, James, I heard a good word from my doctor that I want to share with you too because I think you should try it. I said, what's that? She said, breathe. Every once in a while, at least once a day, take a deep breath. Breathe deeply. Remember that you are alive. Minister to yourself a word of peace, the assurance that God's Spirit is in this breath, giving you life. Breathe. At least once a day. Maybe you'll get good at it and you'll breathe all day long. That would be a nice thing. Sometimes in the office, we need to remind each other to do these things when times become anxious or we become too hard on ourselves. We're invited this morning to receive the grace of Jesus Christ, to be forgiven, to be freed of these burdens, and to treat ourselves accordingly. Amen. We do this largely so that we will have something to give to others, so that we will be liberated and unencumbered as we go to serve the hungry, the lonely, and those who are grieving. This morning we gather around this table and we are invited to fully receive this meal where Jesus says, "This is my cup of the new covenant poured out for you and for many for the forgiveness of sins. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me." Regularly we are meant to come to the source of forgiveness, to be forgiven, and then to go relieve others of their burdens. Let us remember Jesus today. Let us walk on the road with him. Let us gather at this table to be forgiven forever by his grace, so that we may go and offer others this same life-giving love. And may all the people say, amen.